Hello, my name is Philippe Vesser and I hold a PhD in economics. Over the course of my career, I've been a financial analyst, an executive for an industrial firm, and an investment manager. This video is the result of questions I mulled over when I was a financial analyst in the 80s. Back then, French companies were only moderately profitable, while American companies were highly profitable. This meant French companies were heavily indebted, unlike their American counterparts. I had also read, however, that French households had little debt, while American households were heavily indebted. This got me thinking about whether there might be a connection between household and corporate debt. I also started thinking more generally about how the accounts of the different economic sectors might interact with each other. It was only when I retired that I was really able to spend time looking into this question. I then realized that what was interesting about the problem was its implication for controlling the public deficit. When does a public deficit happen? Obviously, it happens when public spending is greater than public revenue. But that's not the only reason. A public deficit always reflects another macroeconomic imbalance, and it's useful to understand that imbalance to bring down the public deficit. That is the subject of this video. A second video will deal with the link between growth and the public deficit. Is growth always the way to reduce the public deficit? This demonstration will use a relationship that is well known in national accounting but is not normally used in economic analysis. Let's first look at this relationship before discussing why it's not normally used in economic analysis. According to this relationship, if the economic units are grouped into sectors, the sum of an economy's sectoral balances is nil. So, if an economy is broken down into corporations, household, the public sector, and the rest of the world, then corporate balance plus household balance plus sector public balance plus rest of the world balance equal 0. Of course, the relationship remains true if all the terms are divided by the same amount, such as GDP, which measures economic activity. Therefore, corporate balance ratio plus household balance ratio plus sector public balance ratio plus rest of the world balance ratio equal 0. Before we continue, let me explain what is meant by a sectoral balance. A sectoral balance is the sum of all the revenue that a sector receives from other sectors through its economic activity minus the sum of all expenditures that it pays out to the other sectors. It includes all revenue and all expenditure from economic activity, regardless of their nature. This means that expenditure includes both consumption spending and investment spending. Each sectoral balance is also equal to the sum of the balances of the sectors of each economic unit within that sector. I will not demonstrate this, but it would be very easy to do so. The difference between all revenue and all expenditure for a certain period is, in a sense, the saving that has been made during that period. I will therefore sometimes call this balance the pure savings, to distinguish it from the savings normally used in economic analysis, which is defined differently. Finally, this balance is also basically equal to what national accounts refer to as net lending or net borrowing, with only a slight difference not worth discussing in this presentation. We prefer the term balance, which seems simpler. Why is the sum of the sectoral balances equal to 0? The sum of the balances of all sectors is equal to the difference between the sum of all intersectoral revenues and the sum of all intersectoral expenditures. However, whenever an exchange takes place between two sectors, one sector's revenue is the other's expenditure. Therefore, in the sum of the balances of all sectors, for each revenue there is an expenditure of the same value, and vice versa. But bear in mind that the sum of the sectoral balances is equal to 0 only if the conditions I've just mentioned are met. The system used for national accounts must be such that when a revenue for one sector is recorded, the corresponding expenditure for the other sector must also be recorded, and vice versa. Otherwise, different elements come into play in the relationships. These elements are the revenues that are recorded with no reciprocal expenditures and the expenditures that are recorded with no reciprocal revenue. This new relationship, therefore, does not accurately reflect flows between sectors, since there are other elements that merely reflect accounting conventions. The problem with such a relationships is that it hides a very interesting problem: how sectors control their balance. It's precisely this kind of relationship that economic analysis normally uses to analyze how intersectoral flows operate. A third video, entitled Accounting Observations, addresses this point. Let's now look at the main observation underlying this discussion: the problem of sectors controlling their flows. To better understand this, let's reorganize the relationship between the sectoral balance ratios. Let's begin by replacing the rest of the world balance ratio with the external balance ratio, which is equal to its opposite, since revenues from the perspective of the rest of the world are expenditures from the perspective of the analyzed economy, and vice versa. The relationship between the ratios therefore becomes corporate balance ratio plus household balance ratio plus sector public balance ratio minus external balance ratio equals 0. This also means that the sum of the balance ratios of the corporate, household, and public sectors is equal to the external balance ratio. The corporate, household, and public sector balance ratios are therefore intrinsically linked to each other. This dependence between the three balance ratios raises the question of how these three sectors can control those balances. Let's look at an example that illustrates this problem. To keep things simple, let's consider a closed economy. In a closed economy, the external balance ratio is 0, as no foreign trade takes place. In such a scenario, the sum of the corporate household and public sector balance ratios is zero, which means it's impossible for all three of these balance ratios to be positive simultaneously. If two of the balance ratios are positive, then the third one must necessarily be in deficit. Every so often, the excessive debt of certain sectors sparks an economic crisis. We can always dream of a virtuous economy in which no corporation or household goes into debt and the state has a positive balance. But this is simply impossible in a closed economy. It's possible only in an open economy, since the external balance can be positive. If the external balance ratio is positive, the three other balance ratios can also be positive. However, the equilibrium in that virtuous economy requires imbalances in the other economies, since a positive external balance in one economy requires at least one negative external balance elsewhere. In these other economies, another sector at least, either the corporate or the household or the public sector, will be in deficit, and the greatest the deficit of the external sector, the greatest this latter deficit will be. A sector's capacity to control its balance depends on whether the units that form the sector can control their own balance. In other words, it depends on those units being able to adapt their expenditures as quickly as possible to fluctuations in their revenues. My theory is that there is a fundamental difference between the public sector on the one hand and corporations and households on the other. Sub-theory number 1. In response to fluctuations in their revenues, households can quickly adapt certain expenditures to maintain or vary their pure savings ratio. Obviously, adapting to the new revenue can be painful, but that's besides the point. Sub-theory number 2. In response to fluctuations in their revenues, corporations can also quickly adapt certain expenditures to maintain or vary their pure private savings ratio and control their debt levels. To achieve this, they have two discretionary expenditures at their disposal: investment and dividends. If, for instance, there is a sudden drop in revenue, corporations can quickly downscale their investment plans to reduce their debt or to take on as little debt as possible. Sub-theory number 3. The public sector is not as flexible as the other two sectors. In a sense, it seems to have more control than the other sectors, because the government can decide to vote in new taxes. But once the new taxes are introduced, the rules for the production of public revenue are fixed, and public revenues, like corporate and household revenues, will depend on the economic cycle. The public sector has much less freedom than corporations and households to adapt its expenditure to its revenue. Just as budget approval defines the rule for the production of public revenue, budget approval also largely sets the rules for the production of public expenditure, making this expenditure fairly rigid. The difference between the public sector and the two other sectors therefore lies in the rigid budgetary procedure and the delays that occur as a result. Take, for example, a household's response to a tax increase. If a household with an income of 40,000 euro has a pre-tax expenditure of 30,000 and spends 9,000 on taxes, it's left with a balance of 1,000 euro, or a balance ratio of 2.5%. Now, suppose that the following year it had the same revenue, but its taxes increased by 1,000. That household can choose either to maintain the same level of pre-tax spending, in which case it will have a balance of 0, or to reduce its pre-tax expenditure by 1,000, maintaining the same balance ratio as the previous year. The decision is down to the household. If the household maintains the same balance, and all other households do the same, their pre-tax expenditure will fall, resulting in a decline in economic activity. This means the tax base from which all taxes are levied will narrow. The government may well respond by voting in new taxes, but households can then react again. I'm not saying that all tax increases lead to an equal reduction in household pre-tax expenditure. All I'm saying is that households themselves decide how and when to react to changes to their taxes. Similarly, they decide how they will react to any changes in revenue, whether from the public sector, social benefits, or salary paid by the public sector to civil servants. I propose that this is true not only for households, but also for corporations. If taxes change, for instance, corporations will adjust other areas of expenditures, which they can do through dividends paid out to shareholders. When different elements are connected, those that are quickest to adapt determine those that are the slowest. The corporate, household, and public sector balance ratios are connected, and because of limits imposed by budgetary procedure, the public sector cannot adapt nearly as quickly as corporations and households. The public balance ratio is therefore determined by the other balance ratios. To express this dependence, we can rearrange the relationship between the balance ratios like this. Public balance ratio equals external balance ratio minus corporate balance ratio minus household balance ratio. These two sectors, corporations and household, can be referred to collectively as the private sector. The sum of the corporate balance ratio and the household balance ratio is equal to the private sector balance ratio, which we can also call the pure private savings ratio. We can therefore conclude that the public balance ratio is determined by the external balance ratio and the pure private savings ratio, and is equal to the difference between these two balances. We must, however, ask whether the pure private savings ratio significantly reflects the savings habit of the private sector. When a corporation assesses its balance, it tends to do so in relation to its revenue rather than in relation to GDP. However, in the previous slides and the ones still to come, the corporate balance ratio is expressed not with regard to corporate revenues, but with regard to GDP. But When corporate revenues share of GDP changes, it does so very slowly. The figures show that variations in the corporate balance ratio, the proportion of corporate revenue, is strongly correlated with variation in the corporate balance ratio, the proportion of GDP. Variations in the corporate balance ratio as a proportion of GDP therefore significantly reflects variations in corporate savings habits. The same is true for households, although the pure private savings ratio significantly reflects the savings habits of the private sector. Is there any logic behind this deduced relationship? The public balance ratio moves in the opposite direction to the pure private savings ratio. This is hardly surprising. It makes perfect sense, for instance, that when the pure private savings ratio decreases, in other words, when the private sector spends a larger proportion of its revenue, growth will ensue, which will normally improve the public balance ratio. The relationship deduced also states that the public balance ratio moves in the same direction as the external balance ratio. Once again, this is hardly surprising. It makes perfect sense that when the export to imports ratio increases, growth will ensue, which will normally improve the public balance ratio. But what is surprising and counterintuitive in this relationship is the absence of any element directly linked to fiscal policy. Neither public revenue nor public expenditure is part of the equation. Does that mean that fiscal policy has no impact on the public balance? Of course not. Fiscal policy does affect the public balance, but it does so indirectly via the external balance ratio, as I will explain. A marginal increase in public spending stimulates economic activity, which usually results in a rise in imports. An economy's exports, meanwhile, depend not on its own volume of activity, but on that of the rest of the world. However, a marginal rise in economic activity triggered by additional public spending normally has no significant impact on the rest of the world's activity, and exports remain the same. If imports increase and exports remain the same, the external balance ratio will fall, which will result in the same fall in the public balance ratio. The same would be true for a marginal fall in public spending or for a marginal increase or decrease in taxes. In conclusion, fiscal policy's impact on the public balance ratio occurs through its impacts on the external balance ratio. Let's now look at what we can learn about the real economy from this relationship. We have data for the USA which are significant for two reasons. First, because they are for the world's largest economy, and second, because they are available for a long period, from 1959 to 2016. Let's look at the first component of the pure private savings ratio, the corporate balance ratio. Over the period I've just mentioned, the US corporate balance ratio fluctuated around an average just below zero, at around -1%. Most of the time, however, the US corporate balance ratio was negative. From a strictly financial standpoint, this kind of saving habits makes perfect sense. A profitable corporation is more beneficial to its shareholders when it has a small amount of debt. This is referred to as leveraging. Sometimes, though, corporations drastically adjust their balance ratio to make it positive, which is referred to as deleveraging. Deleveraging took place in the mid-70s, the early 2000s, and most dramatically, the late 2000s. Each of these adjustments took place during a recession. Once again, it makes perfect sense for corporations to look to reduce their debts during a recession, or, if that is impractical, to take on as little debt as possible. Let's move on to the second component of the pure private savings ratio, the household balance ratio. Like the corporate balance ratio, the household balance ratio tends to fluctuate. But, unlike the corporate balance ratio, the household balance ratio has almost always been positive. Only one period bucked the trend, and that was the early 2000s, when households took on new debt. In nearly all the countries studied, households tend to generate a positive pure private savings ratio. Periods where they have a negative pure private savings ratio, because they spend more than they earn, are very rare. But the size of the positive pure private savings ratio varies considerably from one country to another. In the USA, the average household balance ratio for this very long-term period was a moderate 3%. In addition, as in the case of corporations, we see abrupt increases in the balance ratio, which peak during recessions. Mid-70s, early 80s, early 90s, late 2000s. The pure private savings ratio consists of the corporate balance ratio and the household balance ratio. As we've just seen, for the period being studied in the USA, these two ratios are very similar in nature. The peaks and troughs fluctuate around an average, and big increases tend to take place during recessions. Since the pure private savings ratio is a combination of two quite similar balance ratios, it amplifies the characteristics of the two. The pure private savings ratio, therefore, has sharp fluctuations. The rises in the ratio are markers for all the recessions that have taken place since the 70s. Between two recessions, the pure private savings ratio oscillates by at least 4%, falling after a recession and rising before and during it. It's true, as I have already said, that it makes perfect sense for corporations to spend less during a recession. But, at the same time, the recession may have occurred because corporations and households curbed their spending. Perhaps corporations had invested too much and households had consumed too much, and both groups decided to spend less, sparking a recession. So, did the fall in pure private savings cause the recession, or was it a result of the recession? Either way, we know that a rise in pure private savings in a recession leads to a similar fall in the public balance ratio. Over the very long term in the USA, the average pure private savings ratio is 2%, which is less than the averages of most other countries. Finally, it's worth noting that there was an unusually low negative level of private saving in the early 2000s. How do these variations in pure private savings affect the public balance? As you can see in the graph, the effects are immediate, with short-term fluctuations in pure private savings driving fluctuations in the public balance. The less revenue the private sector spends, the more the public balance goes into deficit. And the more revenue it spends, the more the public balance ratio improves. In the USA, the public balance ratio oscillates cyclically in response to fluctuations in the pure private savings ratio. Peaks in the pure private savings ratio, shown here as troughs because the scale of the pure private savings axis is inverted, coincide with troughs in the public balance ratio, periodic peaks in the public deficit, and, as we saw on the previous slide, recessions. There is a strong correlation between short-term fluctuations in the public balance and short-term fluctuations in pure private savings in the United States. But there is no indication that this is a hard and fast rule. In an oil-based economy, for instance, public balance fluctuations may well be determined not by fluctuations in pure private savings, but by oil price fluctuations, which would affect the external balance ratio. The influence of America's external balance on its public balance is also visible. It has moderate short-term effects, such as in the 80s, when there was a fairly weak short-term correlation between the public balance and pure private savings. In the long run, however, the effects are much more pronounced, hence the lag between one curve and another at the start of the period. The US external balance changed during the period. At the start, from the 60s to the mid-70s, the external balance ratio oscillated, but on average it was balanced. It then went on a downward trend that lasted until the mid-2000s, which is why the American public deficit was only 2% of GDP in 1960, but reached 5% of GDP in 2016, even though the pure private savings ratio was 2% in both years. We can make an important inference from this. A public balance should always be assessed in light of economic conditions to try to put the structural and cyclical aspects of this deficit into perspective. By way of example, let's consider the USA in the year 2000. For once, there was a positive public balance for the year. So, the public accounts were healthy, or so it seemed. In reality, the public accounts were not so healthy, because when there is a public surplus, despite a very large external deficit, minus 5% of GDP in this case, it is because pure private savings are also negative, also at minus 5% of GDP. The private sector was spending more than it was earning, but, as we have already seen, this behavior is very unusual. Normally, the private sector spends less than it receives, and America's pure private savings ratio averages 2% of GDP over the very long term. As soon as the pure private savings ratio returns to this level, the public balance will fall back into structural deficit, reaching a very unhealthy -7% of GDP. Over the following years, the public balance plunged even further into the red, reaching -9% of GDP in 2012. But that was because the pure private savings ratio was well above its long-term average at 6%. When the pure private savings ratio is at its long-term average of 2% of GDP, the public balance ratio should be -6%, whereas in 2000 it should have been, as we have seen, -7%. Despite appearances, overall, the equilibrium of the public accounts has improved slightly. Why? Because the external balance has improved slightly, from -5% to -4% of GDP. An excessive public deficit can be structural or cyclical. It can be simply due to an exceptionally large temporary spike in pure private savings, as occurred on several occasions in the USA during recessions. If so, then once the recession is over, the corporations that drastically scaled down their investments during the recession will once again invest at their pre-recession levels, households will return to their pre-recession consumption levels, and pure private savings will return to normal, thus absorbing some of the higher than usual public deficit. This kind of excessive public deficit is cyclical. But what about when an excessive public deficit is structural? What is the cause of such a deficit? Is it due to structurally excessive pure private savings? Or is it due to a structurally deficient external balance? The private sector's inclination to spend or save varies greatly from one country to another. I believe this is due to deep-rooted cultural differences. In the Netherlands, for instance, corporations do not borrow and save a lot. The same is true in Japan. In Switzerland, on the other hand, it is households that save a lot. Can governments really do anything to change these cultural behaviors? Can governments really do anything that will have a lasting effect on the level of pure private savings? I believe they cannot. Whether governments realize it or not, the only way they can reduce a structural public deficit is by reducing the external deficit. A successful supply policy will achieve precisely that. If the state fails to adopt such a policy quickly enough, there is a risk that its debt might create a crisis of confidence. If that happens, it would have to urgently adopt extreme austerity, thus reducing imports by sparking a recession. The external balance would then improve, as would the public balance. What can we conclude from this analysis? The first major point is that a public balance must always be assessed in light of the current economic conditions. Sometimes surpluses can be misleadingly reassuring, while deficits can create unnecessary alarm. That is why it it is essential to distinguish between the cyclical and structural parts of the change in the public balance. Between 2010 and 2014, the USA and France pursued relatively tight fiscal policies. But it would be a mistake to attribute the improvements of around 4% in their public balance ratios to those policies. The main factor that drove down their public deficits was the decline in their pure private savings ratios, which returned to normal after increasing a lot during the 2008-2009 crisis. Note that I am not saying efforts to moderate public spending during that period were futile. That's a separate discussion. All I'm saying is that it would be an analytical error to attribute the 4% improvement in the public balance to the curbs on public spending, or to assume that if the governments continue to limit their spending, it will automatically have the same effect. It all depends on what happens to the pure private savings ratio and, of course, what happens to the external balance ratio. The second major point is that it is in the public interest for pure private savings to be moderate. It's not good for households or corporations to save too much. Japanese corporations, for instance, save too much, hence the country's public deficit. If Japanese corporations paid out their surplus in dividends, and those who received the dividends spent them, Japan's public deficit would fall. The third major point is that reducing a structural public deficit requires greater external competitiveness. If a country's structural pure private savings ratio is moderate, foreign trade should be balanced, in which case the public balance would be in deficit, though a moderate deficit. If the structural pure private savings ratio is high, there is only one way to prevent an excessive structural public deficit. The external balance is to be structurally positive. The flip side of having this surplus is that there must necessarily be an external deficit elsewhere. The problem then is simply passed on to others. For a more in-depth analysis, read Reducing the Public Deficit, which is available as a hard copy on Amazon. The book goes into more detail, looking at several case studies, with data presented in the form of tables and graphs. Also, take a look at the website deficitandgrowth.com, which includes data regarding the countries for which the OECD provides the information that my analysis method requires. On the site, you can consult the data in the form used by my method, and you can work with the data using simulation tools. Finally, a second YouTube video called Growth looks at the link between growth and the public deficit. A third video, entitled Accounting Observations, deals with more technical matters, in particular the relationship between investment and savings in traditional economic analysis, which is different from the concept of pure savings that have developed. All of these publications are also available in French. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to send any comments to deficitandgrowth@gmail.com.